Detroit Observatory was built in 1854 and conceived of by Henry Tappan, who would later become the first president of the university. That it was an observatory Tappan and the Regents chose as one of the first buildings to represent campus is no accident. It signaled commitment not only to the usual classical discourse of other universities at the time, but an innovative new scientific course that would guide Michigan towards its current status as a leading research university. The observatory cost $22,000 to build and was funded almost entirely by investors from Detroit, hence the name Detroit Observatory. These fundraising efforts were headed by Henry N. Walker, a wealthy railroad attorney with ties to Detroit and its circles of scientists and businessmen. Most of the money went to two telescopes, the first being the Meridian Circle Telescope, used primarily to track the position of stars across the sky. This turned out to be extremely beneficial for Midwestern railway workers at the time.
Subscribers to the observatory, and I think actually the White Cell book has a really great list of these subscribers, and they helped fund this observatory with the idea that it would support science in Michigan, but also timekeeping. So they would take this telescope, measure stars in the sky as they transit the meridian, update the clocks, sell that time to the city of Detroit, the railroad that ran across Michigan from Detroit to Chicago, into Canada, down into Ohio, and everybody who was along that railroad and in Detroit would use this observatory to set their watch for nearly 25 years.
The Fitz Refracting Telescope is the observatory's other telescope, and at the time, it was the third largest refracting telescope in the world. At the time of installation, it was used primarily in research to identify and track asteroid paths and was only accessible to astronomers and astronomy students in the university. In many ways, the observatory was built around these telescopes, both literally and figuratively. For example, the mount the Fitz Refractor Telescope is built on is aligned with a meridian to give astronomers a familiar mark in the sky from which to mark the transits of celestial bodies. The Meridian Circle Telescope is oriented north-south, with a chair on a track that moves with the telescope. Both telescopes are built on enormous concrete piers which go all the way to the basement floor. These piers are not connected to the building in any way because the telescopes are so heavy that builders feared if the pier collapsed, it would take the rest of the building with it. The refracting telescope was installed within a dome that opens to the night sky using a railroad-style track and pulley system with 360-degree rotation. On a clear night, one would simply open the hatch and then rotate the telescope and the roof itself towards the intended coordinates to view and begin to observe. We were fortunate enough to experience this for ourselves. However, it is important to note not just the structural, but the aesthetic components of the Detroit Observatory as well. It was designed in the Greek Revival style and mirrors local residential buildings of the time, such as the Kempf House of 1853 and the Wilson War House of 1835. Some common threads between these buildings are the low-pitched front gable roofs, detailed cornices, and heavy columns that refer to the column orders of classical architecture. Also of note is the prominence of stucco within the observatory. It was applied to the exterior of the platforms supporting the telescopes and then scored to suggest the idea of brick. This was a common practice in local architecture at the time, so much so that Ann Arbor earned the nickname Little Stucco Village because people wanted the Greek Revival, powerful, academic look of quarried stone, but material of such quality was difficult to find in Michigan. Thus, the observatory's style was a strategic decision to respond both to existing architecture, such as the stuccoed Wilson War House, and send a message that it was to be a prestigious, well-respected institution. But what did the day-to-day operations of the observatory look like in the mid to late 1800s? What remains today after decades of repairs and renovations can give us a clue. Today, the director's office, pictured here, is a gallery space, but historically it would have been the room from which most business would have been conducted. There is a faint seam in the wall that shows where the room was once divided into two, an office for the director and space for the students employed there to do computations and reports. The comparisons of window detailings between the two halves of the room, ornate versus plain, further implies this division of power between administrator and student. This is an example of the work these astronomers and students would have been doing in a space like the observatory office. They painstakingly recorded weather every day to report to local communities and to track overarching patterns. This 1894 news article highlights the importance of the observatory in weather tracking. It was only through their measurements that the public would know about wind speeds of storms such as the one people are reacting to here. So, as the observatory entered the 20th century, it was riding this previous wave of technological advancement and scientific discovery.
Pictured here is the 1854 building with the 1868 addition of a director's residence on the north side of the building. This housed professors and directors of the observatory, giving them direct access to the facility. As interest and usage of the observatory grew over the next several years, it was determined that another addition, one with classrooms, telescopes, domes, and labs, was necessary to accommodate the interest. The 1908 addition was added to the east side of the building and housed a 37-inch reflector telescope. By the mid 1900s, technology had advanced some, and the observatory's instruments were not always keeping up. Adding to the difficulties, the central power plant was built just next door in 1914, pumping pollution into the air and further detrimenting night sky visibility. This, paired with the slowly declining technology, led to an overall drop in observatory usage. The university continued to grow in other places besides the observatory. Investments were put into other projects, such as the Alice Lloyd Dormitory that was built on the east side past the addition in 1949. At the time, this dorm was a women's only dorm, but this was not the first we've seen of women interacting with the observatory. In fact, it was all the way back in 1904 that UMich had their first female PhD astronomer, Harriet Bigelow, who went on to continue her work with the observatory until 1934. Besides that, there is also a history of women involvement with astronomy in Ann Arbor, as shown in this image of the American Astronomical Society of 1919 with the inclusion of several women, very progressive of the time. Outside the scope of astronomy, the University of Michigan seemed to be pretty progressive in general in terms with women on campus. One quote from 1876 even mentions a recent graduate stating that a healthy and hearty relationship and honest rivalry between young men and women exists on campus and benefits all students. That being said, there were many limitations put on women for a long time on campus, such as where they could go, what they could do, and who they could do it with. For much of the observatory's history, there were limited roles of women, and many were required to have supervision while performing studies, even if they were their own research. Circling back to the development on campus, the university continued to grow with men and women alike. The context of the observatory continued to change and evolve, and still does today. In 1954, it was determined that the underused observatory was taking up land that could be used to support the growing campus. It was at this time that the director's residence was demolished to make way for what is now Cousins Hall. Time went on, campus still grew enormously, and there was little developments made on the observatory. Again, investments were turned to other departments, and in 1976 it was decided that the observatory was needing more upkeep than it was worth. The plan was to demolish the entire property, but there was some backlash against destroying the original building, particularly from a woman named Hazel Losh. Hazel, or Doc Losh, was a professor in the astronomy department, recalled as the best teacher I ever had teach me anything by a former student. She, along with other members of the community, advocated for the original building and its historical significance. One paper from 1971 notes that Ann Arbor has always had great pride and interest in the observatory. Ultimately, the 1908 addition was razed, but the original building was spared to be restored later in time. After all was said and done, the original building, like I said, was saved, now surrounded by just a power plant and some dorms, and remained largely unoccupied for most of the 80s, with only bare bones maintenance. Little is known about student or faculty involvement during this decade, but there are remnants of graffiti in the basement from when students broke in to explore the facility. One account by Peg Stanek, a history professor at the time, says squatters were gaining access by climbing the chestnut tree out front and entering through the trap door in the roof. Evidence of occupancy, such as mattresses and Kentucky Fried Chicken boxes, littered the dome room, and a mural was painted around the wall of the dome. Overall, engagement and usage of the observatory ebbed and flowed throughout the decades and continues to do so with later additions and restorations.